Good afternoon.
Meeting is being recorded.
Cindy, good afternoon. Shafiq, how are you? Hello, can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Can I get some response, please? Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, people. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? All right, I need people to respond. You need to respond. I need to hear you. You unmute your mic, then you respond, right? So Cindy, good afternoon. JK, good afternoon. I want to hear you. I want someone to respond, please. I don't want to talk to a silent class. Anyone who can respond to me?
Good afternoon, teacher. We can hear you.
All right, Cindy, is that Cindy or Cindy? Are you the one talking? Okay, my name is Tr.Okello. I am a teacher of history. I teach in Taiba International School. Taiba International School is found along Entebbe Road, around Vivaja, just a short distance from Entebbe Airport. That's where I teach. So I'll be teaching you history paper 3. I believe this is senior 5. Are you all in senior 5? Is anyone who's not in senior 5? Okay, very fast. Let us introduce ourselves. Me, I'm called Tr.Okello. So I want to know the rest of the people who are here. Karen, where are you right now? Which school do you go to?
Gaza High School.
Yes, Karen? Which school do you go to?
Gaza High School.
Gayaza High School, all right. Okay. Do you know teacher Arrested?
Yes, teacher.
Hey, what does he teach you there? Oh, she's
Paper
no longer
3.
there. History paper 3. Okay. So how far have you got with the paper 3? Like which topic are you right now? On which
We
topic are
finished
you?
the restored bourbons.
The restored Bourbon monarchy. All right. Okay. So today we are going to do some kind of revision. I have prepared questions and answers. So it's going to be some kind of a seminar, something like that. So I have set questions right from the French Revolution, I think, up to Metternich. It has answers. So I'm going to share the material here, and then you see the questions we are going to discuss today. So let me share, and then you see what you're going to discuss. Let me know if you are able to see what I'm sharing. Can you see what I'm sharing already? Can you see what I'm sharing?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So we have that first question. To what extent was the character of the king responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution? You ignore those names in the bracket. Those were names of students I had given these questions to discuss in my school. So, what do you think is the approach to that question, number one? Who can give me the approach to question number one? Who's ready to give us the approach for number one? To what extent was the character of the king responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution? Is it a two-sided question or it is a one-sided question?
Two-sided.
It is two-sided. So what do we do exactly? Where do we start? What do we start with? In the introduction, do we introduce the background of the king or introduce the background of the French Revolution? Because there are two issues here. On one side, we have to discuss how the king caused the French Revolution, and then on the other side, we have to discuss the other factors that also caused the revolution. So what do we introduce? What do you think we should introduce
The
there?
revolution.
You introduce the background of the French Revolution, and then you look at the different ways in which the king was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution. So, who wants to give me an introduction briefly? If you were to introduce that question, how would you introduce? And then after the introduction, where do we go? Yes. I want someone who can briefly give me some highlight on that question. Okay, let me go direct to the answers to that question, and then we see what the question actually demands. So here you can see what the question requires. Candidates are expected to do what is shared there. You can see. Candidates are expected to give a brief background of the French Revolution, clearly explain the role of the king in the outbreak of the French Revolution, analyze the role of the other factors towards the outbreak of the French Revolution, and the standpoint is required. So, if you were to give an introduction to that question, maybe you'd say the French Revolution was a fundamental change that took place in France. It started in 1789 and it ended in 1799. The French Revolution took place in three phases. The first phase was from 1789 up to 1792. The first phase was largely peaceful. The second phase of the French Revolution started in 1792 up to 1794. The second phase of the French Revolution was largely violent. And the third phase of the French Revolution started in 1795 and ended in 1799. The third phase of the French Revolution was called the Directorate government. The first phase of the French Revolution was led by Count Mirabeau. The second phase of the French Revolution was led by many people, but the most dominant person was Maximilian Robespierre. And the third phase of the French Revolution was called the Directorate Government, and it was led by many people, many directors. So the French Revolution was caused by many factors. But in this case, they have asked us to explain how the character of the king caused outbreak of the French Revolution. So we need to first consider how the character of the king was actually responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution. But before we do that, we need to give a standpoint. So if you were to give a standpoint in this case, what would you say? The king was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution to a greater extent or to a lesser extent, to a bigger extent or to a smaller extent. What would you say, in your own opinion? How far do you think the king was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution? Was it to a greater extent or to a smaller extent? Yes, Karen? To what extent do you think the king was responsible for the outbreak of the revolution? In your opinion, what do you think?
To a smaller extent.
Okay, why do you say to a smaller extent? Would you like to give us a reason why? Okay, maybe as you continue thinking about why the king was responsible for the outbreak of the revolution, and you say to a smaller extent, the extent doesn't really matter. What is important is, do you know how to state the standpoint? Whether you say to a smaller extent or you say to a bigger extent, it does not really matter. What is important is we mark if you know how to state the standpoint. All right. So now, let me first ask, imagine, how many girls do we have here? We have Karen, and who else? Okay. So Karen, imagine you are going to school, you have finished school, but somehow along the way, for some reason, your parents are unable to finish, to pay for your school fees. And then you get a boyfriend who's a rich man, and he has paid your school fees. And then you have finished school, and then it is your graduation day. Your parents are there, and then your boyfriend is also there. So the question is, whom are you going to thank? You have been given a chance to make a speech. Whom will you thank? Are you going to thank your boyfriend more because he enabled you to finish school? Or you're going to thank your parents because they started paying school fees for you? Who is more important?
Your parents.
Your parents. Why? It is because your parents gave birth to you, your parents took you to school, and your boyfriend found you because your parents had started giving you or taking you to school. So another person would say maybe the boyfriend, because the boyfriend enabled her to finish school. And after that, she's going to live with the boyfriend. So in other words, a standpoint does not really matter. The most important thing is to get your stand. That is the most important thing. So, looking at how the king caused the French Revolution, you can see there are very many ways the king caused the French Revolution in different ways, as you can see here. The king became king of France in 1774. The king had a very weak personality. Would you like to say something about the weak personality of the king? What shows that the king had a weak personality? In which ways did the king show his weakness as a person? In which ways did the king show his weakness as a person? So the king of France was called King Louis XVI. He had a weak personality in different ways. The king was under the influence of his wife, Marie Antoinette, who was very extravagant. And we can blame the extravagancy of the king the extravagancy of the queen on the king, because the king was answerable. The king is said to have a habit of liking for hunting. The king spent much of his time hunting in the royal gardens, and therefore the king wasted a lot of his valuable time hunting. The king was under the watch, on the watch when the queen was spending a lot of money on useless things. For example, it is believed that the king was watching while the queen spent a lot of money buying shoes, paying a lot of money for servants. So in other words, the king was indeed very weak, and because of his weakness, the revolution broke out largely because of his recklessness. The king was a despot. The king issued the letter of the cachet, and this letter made very many people to be imprisoned without trial in France. So if I may ask, what was the letter of the cachet? Have you heard about that letter? The letter of the cachet? What was that letter about? Now that letter was an open letter that was written to people who were believed to be enemies of the monarchy in France. And many people who received such letters were taken to prison without trial. Now, being taken to prison without trial here means that you are arrested and they don't take you to court, but they take you direct to prison. And the king is responsible for that. And when they say the king was a despot, it means the king was a dictator. And therefore, because of his dictatorial tendencies, the revolution broke out. Also, the king relied on very many weak advisors. The king was advised by many people, among whom was the queen, who ill-advised the king on very many issues. For example, the queen advised the king to dismiss the financial controllers. Financial controllers in France by that time would be like the present day minister of finance. So the king dismissed very many of the ministers of finance in France by that time. For example, he dismissed Bishop Tagot, and he also dismissed others. And by dismissing those financial controllers, the king made even more mistakes because of the advice of the queen. And therefore, in the end, the revolution broke out. Another mistake the king did was that he called the Estates General Meeting. And when he called the Estates General Meeting, the king failed to manage or to control the people or the delegates who had come for the meeting. The king's idea was that the estates should meet separately. There were 3 estates in France by that time. The estates were we had the peasants, we had, of course, we had the clergy, and then we had the nobility. So the king wanted to meet the nobility alone, meet the peasants alone, and also meet the clergy alone. And yet, the delegates wanted to meet together. So there was a disagreement between the king and the delegates. And therefore, because of that, the peasants decided to isolate themselves and they went to a nearby tennis court. In other words, it led to the tennis court oath. So when they went to a nearby tennis court, they took an oath. And in the oath, they said they would not disperse until a constitution was drafted in France. So in other words, when the king called the Estates General meeting, instead of using the meeting to solve the problem, he instead caused more problems. It's important to remember that the Estates General meeting was called on 5th May 1789, and that is believed to be the day when the revolution broke out. So in other words, the king made another mistake of calling the Estates General meeting, and that is how the king was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution. Also, the king failed to use his despotic powers to suppress the revolution. It's important to note that the king was in control by the time the revolution broke out. The king was in control of the army. The king was in control of everything, but the king failed to use his power or his authority to contain the conditions in France by that time. And therefore, the king was indeed responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution. Then here, the king dismissed many financial controllers or financial ministers. For example, we had Tagot, we had Necker, and then we had Bishop Brienne. All those were people who were interested in improving the conditions in France economically. But the king instead dismissed them, largely because of the advice of the queen. And therefore, in very many ways, the king was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution because he dismissed the financial ministers or financial controllers. Also, the king dragged France into the disastrous into
Everyone wants to be my wife. Everyone wants to be my
Put the last page. Last page.
Okay, Karen, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Huntington, how are you? Okay, I had to restart the meeting because you guys told me that you were not hearing me. So this is what I was discussing during the time you were not hearing me. Those are the different ways the king was responsible for the outbreak of the revolution. The question we are discussing is up here. The question we are discussing is that to what extent was the character of the king responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution? That is the approach to the question. I already talked about that. Then you can see the points to consider on the side of the role of the king towards the outbreak of the revolution. Then on the other side, I was now discussing the role of other factors. So you can see the role of the American War of Independence. I said it was expensive on the part of France. The war acted as a training ground for the people who later became the leaders of the revolution. For example, Marcus Lafayette. The American War of Independence also led to the outbreak of the French Revolution in a way that it gave the people who later became the leaders of the revolution revolutionary slogans like liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I said also the revolution in France broke out largely because the people in France compared the reasons why the Americans were revolting and the conditions in France. For example, the Americans were revolting because there was an increase in taxation by just £1. But when they reflected on their conditions in France, they discovered that the people in France were paying many forms of taxes, and therefore that made them to feel more justified to revolt than even the people of America. Then you see the role of the queen. The queen was extravagant, the queen was arrogant, the queen was unsympathetic to the people of France, and therefore the revolution broke out because of the role of the queen. And of course, you have the role of the philosophers, people like Voltaire, you had Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and then Montesquieu. These people wrote books that compared the conditions in France with the conditions elsewhere, especially in Britain. And therefore, the people of France voted largely because they read about the conditions in different parts of Europe that were better than France. And that was because the philosophers wrote books. In other words, the philosophers made the people of France to wake up. It made them to wake up, and then when they woke up, they decided to demand for better living conditions like everyone else in Europe. Then had the nature of the ancient regime. The ancient regime was not only despotic, it was also grossly inefficient. There was no clear constitution. There was no rule of law. There were different sets of laws that were applied in different parts of France. And therefore, the people of France likely revolted because of the nature of the ancient regime. Then we had the effects of the social class division. In fact, there were many castes, peasants, we had the nobility and the clergy. But each of them lived differently. For example, the nobility had a lot of privileges. The clergy also had a lot of privileges. And yet the peasants only had grievances. In other words, there was friction between the different classes, but also there was friction among or within each of the classes. For example, we had among the nobility, we had the people who were called nobility of robe, and then nobility by birth. The people who were nobles by birth despised the people who were called nobility of robe. In other words, they felt that those were not rich enough, and therefore there was friction between the nobility of robe and nobility by birth in France. So because of class divisions in France, the revolution broke out. Then we had the grievances of the middle class. The middle class were also called the bourgeoisies. Many of them were highly educated people, but many of them were not happy because they did not get favors from the government. Many of them did not get jobs from the government, or some of them, if they got jobs, they would not be promoted. And therefore, because of that, they remained very disappointed. And because of that, many of them joined the revolution. Then the next factor is the financial crisis in France. Financial crisis here means that the monarchy was bankrupt. There was no money, largely because the king was extravagant, or let us say, because of extravagancy at the king's palace, and also because of the participation of France in useless wars, like the 7 Years' War, and also had the American War of Independence. So because of the financial crisis, the revolution broke out. Then next we have the calling of the Estates General Meeting. It's important to remember that the king called the 3 estates. He called the representatives of the 3 estates, representatives from the peasant class, from the nobility class, and from the clergy. So they came, and when they came, like I said earlier, the king had a different idea about the meeting, and therefore there was a disagreement between the king and especially the peasants. So the revolution broke out largely because of the calling of the Estates General Meeting. And lastly, the influence of France. The influence of England. England was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution in a number of ways because the conditions in England were very good. And therefore, the people of France wanted to live like the people of England. And therefore, in that case, we can conclude that the influence of England was indeed responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution. And then after that, you give your standpoint again. If you started by saying that the character of the king was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution to a larger extent, again, you maintain it. So you could say, for example, in conclusion, the character of the king was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution to a larger extent, as explained above. However, there are also other factors that led to the outbreak of the French Revolution, again, as explained above. And then you wait for your 25 marks. Someone will ask question you have just concluded. Any question? Any addition? Is there any point I have not included that they have taught you in your school that I have not mentioned there? Yes? Okay. So let's go to the next question. The next question is, the Reign of Terror, 1792 to 1794, was inevitable. Discuss. What do you think? Is this question two-sided or it is one-sided? Karen.
It's two-sided.
Is that question one-sided or two-sided?
Two-sided.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That question is one-sided. The Reign of Terror was inevitable. Discussed. It is one-sided. All you need to do is to explain the factors that the outbreak of the Reign of Terror. There's no other side of the approach there. Candidates are expected to define the Reign of Terror, to give up the causes of the Reign of Terror, and then conclude. And B, no standpoint is required. The question is one-sided. I know what is confusing you is this word, inevitable. Inevitable here means unavoidable. So this question is one-sided. Those are the points. You can see the causes of the Reign of Terror, and there is nothing else to add. There is nothing else to add. So let's see, what was the Reign of Terror? It was the second phase of the French Revolution. It was the most violent phase of the French Revolution. It was a period that was characterized by a lot of chaos, a lot of havoc, a lot of insecurity, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of uncertainty in France during the French Revolution. During this time, the most dominant character, the most dominant person who led the revolution was called Maximilian Robespierre. There were other leaders we shall talk about then. For example, we had Danton, we had others. So let's see what factors led to the outbreak of the Reign of Terror. In other words, what factors made the revolution to become violent or to become very, very bloody. So the first factor was the outbreak of the French Revolution. It is true that the revolution broke out in 1789, and the revolution remained largely peaceful from 1789 until 1792, when the revolution suddenly became very, very violent. And in other words, the reign of terror was a build-up from the outbreak of the French Revolution, when the revolutionaries discovered that it was not going to be possible to achieve what they wanted unless they applied force and violence. Then they started to apply a lot of violence and force. So the revolution became violent. And we can say that the revolution became violent because the revolution broke out. Then the second is the character of the king. The king was very adamant to the demands of the French revolutionaries. It is on record that the king did not even know that the revolution was already in progress. The king on many occasions resisted the revolution. For example, when the civil constitution of the clergy was signed, the king resisted it. That is one. On one occasion, the king tried to escape from France to go to Austria. All that shows that the king was not interested in the revolution, and therefore the revolutionaries decided to use force largely because of the character of the king. Also, we had very many revolutionary leaders. For example, had Danton, and then we had Maximilian Robespierre. Now, these were two powerful leaders leading two powerful political clubs, and each of them wanted to remain or to be the dominant party. And therefore, they started campaigns of elimination and extermination. For example, Danton wanted to defeat Maximilian Robespierre, and even Maximilian Robespierre wanted to defeat Danton, and they used their supporters. And therefore, there was a lot of chaos. There was a lot of insecurity because of the activities of the leaders during the reign of terror. And therefore, the presence of several leaders or several political parties in France was indeed responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution. Then you had the presence of immigrants outside France. If I ask, in which countries did the immigrants go? Yes, we had immigrants, but where were they? Were they in Austria? Were they in Prussia? Or they were in Russia? Where were the immigrants? So immigrants were people who left France and went to neighboring countries for security reasons. And they were scattered all over Europe in different countries. Some of them were in Austria. Some of them were in Prussia. Now, what did the immigrants do that made the revolution to become violent? What the immigrants did that made the revolution to become violent is that they tried to organize a counter-revolution. In other words, they wanted to come back to France to defeat the revolution and restore the king to his full powers. And that is partly what made the revolutionaries to apply force and a lot of violence, because they heard that the immigrants were regrouping themselves and planning to come back to France to defeat the revolution. So the activities of the immigrants outside France was indeed responsible for the outbreak of the reign of terror. Then we had the presence of several political clubs. There were many. We had the Jacobin Club, led by Maximilian Robespierre. We had the Guillotine Club, led by Danton. We had the Feuillants. So these political clubs were competing for power, led by the different leaders. And each of them believed that the only way to gain this power was through force. And therefore, they applied a lot of violence. And therefore, the revolution became very, very chaotic because of the emergence of these political clubs and their campaigns. Then we had the execution of the king and his wife. It's important to remember that the king was executed in January 1793, and 9 months after, the queen was also executed. But the execution of these two important people made the revolution to become very, very chaotic. Why? Because the king still had sympathizers and supporters. The queen also had supporters, and besides, the queen was from Austria, and therefore the people of Austria were not happy with when they heard the news that the queen was executed, leave alone the execution of the king. And therefore the supporters or sympathizers of the king and his wife made the revolution. The supporters attacked the people who supported the revolution, and the revolution became very, very violent. They only had the death of Mirabeau in April 1791. It's important to remember that Mirabeau was a personal friend to the king, but at the same time, Mirabeau was a sympathizer to the revolutionaries, and therefore, while he was alive, he guided both sides. He guided the king not to make errors, but he also guided the revolutionaries not to apply a lot of force or also not to make errors. So when Mirabeau died, the king made very many mistakes. For example, after the death of Mirabeau, the king attempted to escape to go to Austria, and unfortunately the king was intercepted at Venice. And when they brought the king back, the king was portrayed as a traitor. But also it's important to remember that before Mirabeau died, he had prophesied. He said that if I die, he said on his deathbed, he said that I carry with me the last rags of the monarchy, implying that if he dies, the monarchy would soon collapse. And indeed, when Mirabeau died, very soon the monarchy indeed collapsed. So the death of Mirabeau denied the king a very, very important person to give him direction during the revolution. But also the death of Mirabeau also denied the revolutionaries direction, because when he died, both sides lost, and therefore the revolution became violent largely because of the absence of Count Mirabeau. Then we had the attack on the Catholic Church. It's important to remember that the Catholic Church was under direct attack by the revolutionaries, but the Catholic Church was divided. There were some people who supported the civil constitution of the clergy. Some priests who supported the civil constitution of the clergy, they were called the juring priests. And you had others who did not support the civil constitution of the clergy, and they were called the non-juring priests. So, because of the attack on the Catholic Church, there was division. And the division caused mistrust, and the mistrust caused chaos. And the chaos is what later came to be known as the Reign of Terror. The next one, the declaration of war on revolutionary France by the rest of Europe. It's important to remember that neighboring countries mobilized themselves, formed a coalition, and decided to attack France. The countries that were involved in this coalition were Austria, Prussia, and even Britain. So these countries decided to attack France. And therefore, France was now fighting a defensive war. In other words, the Reign of Terror became also inevitable because France was under attack by her neighbors. The next one was the dismissal of the financial controllers like Necker and Turgot. When the financial controllers were dismissed, the people of France lost hope, and therefore they became very, very violent. they decided to start chaos. They decided to apply force because they realized that the king was not interested in reform. Then you have the outbreak of civil wars in France that led to the reign of terror. I don't know whether you've heard about Babeuf. There was an attempted civil war in France. And because of that, the reign of terror again became inevitable because of the activities of the people who were led by that man called Babeuf. Then you had the emergence of the Herbatists. The Herbatists were a group of political pressure group, members of a political pressure group led by a man called Herbert. And many of them believed in violence. And therefore, they used a lot of force to fulfill their mission. And because of that, the reign of terror became very inevitable. Then you have the formation of the National Assembly and the convention government. It's important to note that during the revolution, the National Assembly was established and a conventional government was also established. Now, this was a government that was dominated by people who had very little experience in leadership. And therefore, many of them believed that the only way to govern people was by using force. And therefore, the reign of terror again became inevitable because of the establishment of the National Assembly and the convention government. So after that, you give your conclusion. Then you could say the reign of terror was the second phase of the French Revolution that was largely very chaotic and violent. It was led by Maximilian Robespierre, and it started in 1792 and ended in 1795. It was caused by very many factors. Some were political, others economic, others social, as explained above. And then you go to the next question, or you go to the next thing. So after that, you wait for your 25 marks. Anything about the reign of terror? Is there anything you want me to explain about the reign of terror that is not clear? Cindy, is everything fine? Okay, we can go to the next question. Let's go to question number 3. Let's go to question number 3. And number 3 is examine the impacts of the French Revolution of 1789 on France. Examine the impacts of the French Revolution on France. What do you think? Is that question two-sided or it is one-sided? Is the question one-sided or two-sided? So I said, examine the impacts of French Revolution. You can see the approach there. Then let's see the point to consider. There are very many factors. There are very many effects of the French Revolution, as you can see. So here we are going to give general effects. For example, you can see the revolution ended class division in France. That's one of the effects. In other words, people after the revolution did not feel they belonged to the peasant class or to the nobility class or to the clergy class. Everybody was the same. Another, it eroded the Catholic Church influence in French politics. In other words, after the revolution, many people did not see the Catholic Church becoming very powerful or very dominant in the politics of France. In other words, even people who were not Catholics were now given a lot of favors after the revolution. The revolution led to conflict between France and other countries. Like I said, France fought very many wars with her neighbors. For example, Austria, Prussia, and Britain attacked France largely because of the success of the French Revolution. Then you had the taxation system in France was changed. It's important to remember that the system of taxation was changed in France. So they introduced a new system of taxation that was called pay. In other words, pay as you earn. So people who were getting more money were taxed more. People who were getting less were taxed less. And that now improved the taxation system in France. Unlike before, where the peasants who were actually earning less were taxed more. So the taxation system in France was changed. The next one, the constitution was redrafted in France. It's important to remember that before the revolution broke out in France, there was no constitution in France. But after the revolution, there was a constitution. So there was a change in that area also. The land that hitherto belonged to the clergy and the nobility was nationalized. In other words, the nobility and the clergy owned a lot of land before the revolution. But after the revolution, the land was redistributed and part of the land was given to the government, or the government took ownership of the land. And that is what we call nationalization of the land. The next one, the parliamentary system was restored in France. In other words, the system of electing representatives to go to parliament in France was restored. It's important to remember that before the revolution, France did not have a functioning parliament. And therefore, after the revolution, France now had a parliament. It's important to remember the name of the French parliament. It was called the National Assembly. Then there was a revival of constitutionalism in France. The constitution was drafted and the constitution was used by the leaders in France. That is what we mean by restoration of constitutionalism in France. Then we had nepotism was abolished. In other words, they introduced a new system that was called career open to all men. In other words, after the revolution, anyone, regardless of somebody's background, would get employment in government and they would get promoted in government. That is the system of career open to all men. And the class system was abolished. The education system was also transformed or reformed. So the peasants were able to also go to better schools that was initially reserved only for the clergy and the nobility. Then there was emergence of political pluralism. Political pluralism here means a situation where you have many political parties and all of them are allowed to participate in politics. In other words, it's like a multi-party system. So you have many political parties and each of them is given freedom to take part in politics. That was initiated after the French Revolution. Then you had the massive loss of life. Many people were killed during the revolution. Prominent people and even insignificant people were all killed the same way. You can give examples. You can talk about people who died, prominent people like the king, the queen. You can talk about Maximilian Robespierre himself was also killed. Danton was also killed, and many other people who died during the revolution. Then it led to war between France and her neighbors. It led to war between France and Austria, between France and Prussia, between France and Britain. So the French Revolution had very many effects, as you have seen. So after explaining all that, then you wait for your 25 marks. Now, in the next 5 minutes, I want to ask if there's anyone who has a question before I make my last mark. We have discussed 3 questions. To what extent was the king responsible for the outbreak of the revolution? We have also discussed the reign of terror was inevitable. And then we have also discussed, examining the impacts of the French Revolution. Is there any question? Any question? Karen, do you have any question? Cindy, any question? All right. Seems there is no question. So, when you're answering European history, key things you should do, or key things that you should remember. Remember, we mark interpretation. Make sure you have not misinterpreted a question, because misinterpretation leads to misfiring. 2, make sure you have identified the point. A point should be identified in a full sentence. For example, if you're talking about the character of the queen related to the outbreak of the French Revolution, you could say, the character of the queen was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution. Then you put a full stop. Then you start explaining how the character of the queen led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. After identifying the point, then you explain. Explaining here means you show how. How did the character of the queen lead to the outbreak of the French Revolution? So here you have to illustrate by giving examples of scenarios where indeed the queen was responsible for the outbreak of the revolution. Then after explaining, then you analyze, or what they call analysis. Now, analysis here means now you connect the question with the answer. For example, you could say maybe in this way or in this respect, therefore, the queen was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution. That is analysis. So 3 things that you have to remember: interpretation, identification of the point, and explanation, and then the last one is analysis. So every point we look for those 3 things: identified point, explained properly, and then the analysis. So that is what you should always remember. And of course, remember to give very many points. Give as many as you can. In fact, you give all the points that were given to you by your teachers. So I want us to end here. It has been good. It has been a very wonderful lesson. It has been very good having you people. I want to give you my telephone number, maybe if you need. Is there anyone who wants this document that I'm sharing today so that you may use it for your own research? So if you need this document, you can contact me on my number. If you want, my number is 0772 199. Let me type my number here. I am going to type my number here. So my number is here, 0772199377. You can WhatsApp me and I text you this document. If you send me a message on WhatsApp, I will send you that document. Otherwise, let us stop here. It has been a wonderful lesson. Let us meet another time. Have a good afternoon and bye-bye. Okay, someone is saying that I should pin the number on the charts. Okay, it is 0772199377. It is there. That is my number. Or you can also reach me on 0704141763. That is also my number.